Geeta is a music journalist and critic. For years, she's written for Slate and for Wired. She wrote an authorized biography of Brian Eno, and she's interviewed folks as varied as William Gibson and David Bowie. She is San Francisco-based currently, and right now freelancing and shopping around a book in the history of electronic music. And she's a real authority on the intersection of art, science, technology, culture, and electronic musics. So with that, I'd like to, without further ado, introduce Geeta Dayal, who will give us a presentation about the history of noise in music, particularly in 20th century electronic tape music. Thanks. Is this your water?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Hi guys, you can all hear me, I'm sure. Yeah, so it's great to be here. I've actually never been to Pittsburgh before. I flew here from San Francisco last night, and I'm here to talk to you about electronic music and noise. So I wanted to start by saying, how many of you guys here have a concept of what electronic music is? Or everybody here does, because we've all heard electronic music. Pretty much if you've heard anything using a microphone and speakers, you've heard electronic music. So why study electronic music? So briefly, I went to MIT for undergrad in the 90s. Then I decided I didn't want to be a scientist. I wanted to basically just study music all day long. So that's like kind of what I ended up doing, because I was so fascinated with electronic music. Now, electronic music has a very long and storied history. You know, it's the more I read about it, the more that I learn. The more that I learn about the history, the more that I realize that all of this stuff has such a long, interesting history. And I've especially gotten really interested in these sort of tinkerers, these sonic tinkerers before there were synthesizers. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about noise first, and then I'll be talking about this sort of crazy DIY scene in the 50s. All right, so first of all, a few thoughts on noise. Now, I think noise has a history, of course, that extends way before the 20th century. You know, there's always been noise. And noise is a part of every part of our lives. But to talk about Russolo for just a minute, Russolo is an interesting guy. Russolo is actually a painter, and this is one of his paintings called La Musica. And Russolo, to be honest, he was kind of a hippie. You know, his concept of noise was not that he wanted life to be full of this sort of, he didn't want to mirror this sort of brute, nasty realism of the machine or war or whatever. You know, the futurists in Italy were all about talking about the glory of speed and the glory of, you know, machines and the sounds of wartime and all this stuff. But, you know, at heart, Russolo was a dreamer. He was an idealist. He was really into the occult. He was really into kind of this whole panorama of sounds. His argument was that music can really be anything. Sound encompasses everything. And that in The Art of Noises, he writes that the characteristic of noise is in reminding us brutally of life, but the art of noises is not about just copying that reality that we hear. He says the art of noise is a fantastic association of different timbres. So it's these sounds we've never imagined, you know, that he wanted to gather together these noises. He wanted something different from a conventional orchestra. You know, you see in his music boxes, in his Intono Rumori, that they're clusters of different sounds, that he's gathered all these different sounds together, and each box that he presented kind of brought all of these different sounds together. But he really, really wanted to extend our idea of what sound could be. Now, who's this guy? Does anyone know who this guy is? It's Edgar Varese, who's the composer. And so why am I talking about 20th century composers? Well, the thing is, Russolo wasn't really a composer. none of us really remember Russolo for the great works of music that he created. Russolo is definitely sort of an engineer and a thinker and a theorist, but I want to talk a little bit about the composers who helped introduce noise into 20th century music. Now, some have argued that Varese was sort of the father of modern electronic music. He wasn't the first, but he had a huge impact. He had a huge impact on John Cage. He had a huge impact on all this legions and legions of electronic composers. So here's a quote from Varese from 1917. "I dream of instruments obedient to my thought, a whole new world of unsuspected sounds that will lend themselves to the exigencies of my inner rhythm." And here's another quote from the year later from the composer Joseph Schillinger, who foresaw that music plus electricity would equal the sound of the 20th century. And so it was already in the air. You know, we wouldn't have synthesizers until the 1960s, but it was in the air. You know, in the early 1900s, people were thinking that what's going to make music different in this century? There was a sense of feeling a little bit tired with maybe the Romantic composers, a sense that music was going to go somewhere different. And that music plus electricity would be the way that music would be different in this bold new century. Now, what's this? Now I want to talk about another composer who had a massive impact on John Cage, and that was Erik Satie. And how many of you guys have heard of Erik Satie? Yeah, a lot of you have. And a lot of what we know Erik Satie for is these very kind of stark, beautiful, sort of minimal pieces of music. Satie wasn't the kind of guy who wrote big symphonies. History remembers the people who wrote big symphonies. In general, in the history of classical music, that's how composers are remembered for their great grand works. But, you know, a lot of the pieces by Satie were meant to be looped for a long time. He had this concept, and this is from his score for his furniture music. And he said, oh, this is like ambient music. It's sound. This was in the 1920s. He said, it's music that's meant to mingle with the sounds of forks and knives at dinner time. You're not supposed to be really listening to it. It's just sort of background music. It's muzak. You know, so he essentially went and decided that he would intentionally make music that sounded like this. And so that also had a tremendous impact on Cage's thinking. Satie's pieces tended to be incredibly short. Some of Varese's most famous pieces, like Ionization, was only 6 minutes long. Now, this is John Cage, a little bit later from those guys, and he's saying, this is kind of his famous statement about noise. What we hear is mostly noise. We're hearing, you know, the truck at 50 miles per hour, the static between radio stations, or rain. These are all, you know, beautiful sounds, you know, whatever. This is very, should seem very common to us, you know. Like when you read this now, you're like, oh, of course, you know. Any of that stuff can be music because we're so conditioned in years of listening to stuff like ambient techno or, you know, any of the kinds of music that people listen to today, that of course, you know, rain sounds could be part of a piece of music. But back then, in 1937, this was still considered kind of, sort of revolutionary. But what Cage was really saying here wasn't that these sounds were particularly beautiful to him. What he was saying was that all sounds should be treated equally. And Cage's big kind of ethos was this, that we need to treat all sounds in the world with equal relevance and equal importance. That you know, that he didn't want some sounds to be considered music and other sounds to just be noise. You know, he felt that everything could be music. Varese used to call music organized sound. He just said that music is just, you know, any group of sounds that are organized together. But here's the most prophetic part of Cage's Future of Music credo. He says that, this is 1937 again, I believe that the use of noise to make music will continue and increase until we reach a music produced through the aid of electrical instruments. And that it's going to be electrical instruments that's going to make, you know, any and all sounds that could possibly ever be heard. But it was a very prophetic statement. And of course, Cage was a real innovator. Cage was a tremendous force in 20th century music. But I think Cage often gets a lot of credit, especially in the art world, and in a lot of other places too. That's almost too much credit, and I would argue, because there were so many people that orbited Cage that also deserved credit. There were all of these people that were giving him ideas. One of the things about history is that history tends to remember the people who are the most articulate. And Cage was a great writer, too. He wasn't just an amazing composer. But he was like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. It's going to be 20 years in the future, but I'm going to write this essay right now that's going to explain what I'm doing. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen was also really good at this. He was another composer that was a really good writer. So he would write down and explain to people what he was doing. And because our culture tends to be very verbal, we tend to really respond to that. So when composers do things that are really hard for us to understand or hard for us to process, it's comforting and useful to see words that explain what they're doing. I'm not knocking Cage. I'm just saying that a lot of the times you'll read stuff Cage has written and you'll find that he's synthesizing other people's thoughts. He's telling you what's in the air, what's in the zeitgeist, what's about to happen. But it was a whole group of people that were making that happen. He was really good at connecting the dots about what was going to happen. So now let's talk a little bit about electronic music. So when Cage said in 1937 that that music was going to be made with electricity, and then you had Joseph Schillinger in 1918 saying that music plus electricity would be the sound of the 20th century. What had we made up to the 1930s? So does anyone know who this is? That's Leon Theremin. And so the theremin was invented in 1919, and it was one of the instruments that really had staying power. In the first half of the 20th century, electronic music as we know it was in its really embryonic stages. The synthesizer didn't exist, but there were various electrical contraptions with amazing names. There was Thaddeus Cahill's Talharmonium. There was the theremin, which was originally called the etherophone. There was the spherophone. There was the trautonium, et cetera, et cetera. But as amazing and revolutionary as these devices were, they were of incredibly limited usefulness. These guys couldn't make their inventions open source and put them on Instructables so that anybody else could build them. These tended to be isolated events in different parts of the world where people made a couple of prototypes. In the case of the theremin, that was one of the only devices that really had staying power that really did become part of our popular culture. But even the theremin was pretty limited in what the theremin could do. How many of you guys have played with a theremin? Okay. So yeah, I mean, the theremin is cool. The theremin can make some pretty interesting sounds, but it's not your whole toolkit. It's not your whole box. It's like, if you're a painter and you're only able to paint with a certain, it's like 2 colors and you can't do anything else. That's kind of what a theremin can do. So it was no substitute for, the synthesizers and other things that would come later. But then there was another way around this that Cage was a fan of, that Varese was a fan of, that a lot of other composers were a fan of. They were inspired by people like Marcel Duchamp, the artist who said that, hey, a bicycle wheel could be a piece of art, or a urinal, or whatever. That they would take these sort of ready-made objects that were already in the environment and say, okay, now I've put it in an art gallery. Now it's my artwork. In the same way, people like John Cage would take something like a bunch of radios or a a turntable and say, okay, you know, this is an instrument now. We're using it in a performance. We're going to make music with this thing. So instead of using these big, heavy contraptions like a theremin or a spherophone or a tritonium, people like Cage would be like, okay, well, we already have radios. Can we make music with radios? Can we make music with this turntable? Can we get it to make some weird sounds that we didn't have before? So that was another way of kind of making electronic music before there were synthesizers. But then there was a game changer. Something happened in the 1930s that changed everything, and that was the tape machine. Now the tape machine was developed in Germany in the 30s, but it didn't really get anywhere in the marketplace in America until the late 40s. And there were like a lot of struggles along the way. The original tape machines used actually paper tape, and the methods for depositing the magnetic material onto that paper tape were very rudimentary. There were all of these reasons why it took a while for tape recording to catch on. The other thing was that America didn't really have big tape machine companies until maybe the late 40s, companies like Ampex that started around then. But at any rate, by the late 40s, artists and musicians realized that tape machines didn't just record sounds, that tape machines were these incredible, powerful tools for making new sounds. So before we had synthesizers, we were using tape machines. That tape machines could make sound like anything you wanted. You could record a train sound or a whistle from outside, and then you could treat it in a bunch of different ways. You could play the sound backwards on your tape machine. You could slow it down. You could run it through effects. You could do all of these different things to the sound that would make it sound really alien or otherworldly. You could make it sound like anything. And so the tape machine was sort of this amazing Swiss Army knife. If you had a tape machine, you could make electronic music. And it was suddenly possible to record and manipulate sounds in ways you never could before. And this leads us to the development in France of something called musique concrète in 1948, which was essentially just a method of making tape music. And what they did, this was in Paris at this place called GRM Studios, was they just stitched together all of these different sounds that they collected from their environment, things like train sounds and whistles and whatever. And they would treat the sounds in different ways, and they would make these really, really intricate constructions, these beautiful kind of collages, very edited down, kind of beautiful pieces made from tape music. Now, by this time, Edgar Varese was already a senior citizen. So we're talking now the late 40s and early 1950s. He went on to make a really famous piece with tape called Poème électronique for the World's Fair in the 50s, which is like a really key piece of electronic music. But the process of making electronic music in the 40s and 50s, I mean, it was really great to have this tape machine, if you were lucky enough to have one, in 1948 or 1949, but normal people didn't really have tape machines. Normal people didn't have analog test equipment laying around that they could play around with. That making electronic music was still usually in the hands of like people with money or big studios. And so it makes sense that our history of electronic music in the 50s especially is really tied to institutions and to studios. This equipment was really bulky. You couldn't, it was very expensive. And so the history of electronic music, you can just reel off sort of a list of studios. You know, there was GRM in Paris. There was NHK in Tokyo. There was the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center in New York. There were also around there was Bell Labs, where they had tons of money to throw at computer music, of all things, which was amazing. You had WDR in Cologne, where people like Stockhausen worked. You had RAI in Milan. So at any rate, we kind of think of electronic music back then as being tied to these institutions in the same way that we think of the history of computing back then as being tied to institutions. Because at that time, you know, if a computer was the size of this auditorium, then only like MIT is going to have one, or Caltech will have one, or Carnegie Mellon will have one. But normal people would not have one in their living room. And in the same way, most people did not make electronic music themselves, with some exceptions. So I'm not going to spend the rest of this talk talking about famous institutions. There's plenty of books about those institutions, and there's amazing stories about those institutions. What I want to talk about is a single case study, and something that has completely captivated me. I've just been obsessed about it for the last 4 years or so. And that's the story of Louis and Bibi Baron, who, do anybody of you guys know who they are? So they were, this was a very DIY thing. In 1948, they were a husband and wife couple who made electronic music in their apartment in New York City. They lived in Greenwich Village on West 8th Street. And they got a tape machine as a wedding gift in 1948. And they were some of the few people that just tinkered and made electronic music themselves in their apartment. So this is an image of what their apartment looked like back then. And it just completely, you know, blew my mind, because I just thought, wow, like, you know, this wasn't the BBC Radiophonic Workshop or, you know, GRM Studios or NHK or whatever. This was just two people, a couple, working in their living room. How on earth did this happen? How did they make some of the most prescient sounding electronic music of all time? So while this whole history that I was telling you about of these sort of famous composers and famous studios was taking place, there was an equally interesting story of these sort of maverick composers of electronic music that really kind of struggled to get by. They were experimenting on their own. They built their own circuits and invented their own instruments. They pushed the limits of tape, and they worked outside the university. And these included people like Raymond Scott, who some of you have probably heard of, or Todd Dockstader, and Louis and Bibi Baron. Now, one of the things I find fascinating about these people is they helped get electronic music into everyday life. So people like Risolo, like the sounds that his noise boxes created were super interesting, but you know, people weren't tuning into Risolo's sounds. But lots of people heard Raymond Scott's electronic sounds because they watched Looney Tunes cartoons, or they heard radio jingles, or they saw TV commercials. So one of the ways that electronic music sort of filtered into our culture, one of the ways that sort of this strange, noisy music that we had never heard before got embedded in the fabric of our everyday lives was through cartoon sound effects, through movies, Hollywood movies, through these ways of just kind of interacting with the everyday. This is Todd Dockstader. And Todd Dockstader made sound effects for Tom and Jerry cartoons. And they're some of the weirdest episodes of Tom and Jerry you'll ever see. I mean, you should... some of them are on YouTube. Look for the one called Tom and Jerry in Space. It's like, it's seriously one of the weirdest electronic music you'll ever hear. But I learned a lot by reading about and studying these people. I actually met Todd. He's so all of these people I'm talking about are all dead, with the exception of Todd, who's in a nursing home in Massachusetts. So last year I traveled up to where he is in this senior citizens home, and I tried to interview him. But he is battling Alzheimer's. He's 84. And out of a 4-hour interview, I managed to extract about an hour of sort of lucidity. But I got a lot out of that hour. And he gave me this tremendous lesson on how hard it was to make electronic music in the 50s and what he had to go through to make electronic music back then. So this is what he told me. You know, he said that after World War II, the way that people made electronic music was a lot of people were really obsessed with ham radios. They were really obsessed with, there was a lot of military surplus gear floating around. And you see that cigarette dangling out of Todd's mouth. He actually made his first edits with a wire recorder by having a burning cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and he would hold the wire up to his face and make the edits by actually melting like the piece of wire with his cigarette, and then kind of putting it back together using his fingers and a little bit of solder. But that was the way he was making edits when he first started. That was the kind of story that really, really got me. I was like, wow, you know, these people making edits with cigarettes, you know, these people working out of their crammed apartment. So this is, to go back to Louis and Bibi Baron, here is sort of the wide-angle view of their living room. This is like in the early 1950s in the West Village in New York. And this is them working. And part of the reason I was so fascinated by their story is that their story sounds like it's something out of a science fiction novel. So they were most famous for creating the soundtrack for Forbidden Planet, but they were outsiders, you know. They're pioneering electronic sounds in the 50s. It was really threatening to make electronic music back then. They were forced to call them electronic tonalities and not music to avoid a lawsuit with the Musicians Union. When Forbidden Planet came out, the LA Times review said, this was the first line, "What the Musicians Union will make of this, I don't know, but a new Hollywood movie has a score played by no human agency." You know, it was like a warning, like, oh my God, the robots have landed. You know, we're going to have this scary electronic music, and that's the way that movies are going to be scored from now on. And it's hard to contemplate in 2013 how absolutely alien it must have been to say you were an electronic music composer in 1956. Louis and Bibi Baron were inspired by Norbert Wiener, who was a professor at MIT. I had to walk by his face every time I walked to my class because there was a big poster of him in the Infinite Corridor. But his book Cybernetics came out in 1948, and then he had another book that came out in 1950 called The Human Use of Human Beings. Kind of a sinister title, sort of. But essentially, cybernetics is just the study of systems. And a lot of early electronic music composers were really, really, really interested in cybernetics. Because one of the central notions of cybernetics is the concept of feedback. And a lot of electronic music, that's a very central concept for electronic music as well, for making noise, for making sound, is feedback. And they were very inspired by this sort of concept of the organism, of these systems. And so Louis and Bibi Baron were completely obsessed with cybernetics. And they thought of their circuits, their homemade circuits they were building. You can see here, you can see a couple of tape machines. You can see that they have an antenna. I don't know if they were getting some sounds out of using that. There's all this stuff around. But the heart of their process for making music was building handmade DIY circuits. Just rudimentary oscillators, recording the sounds of circuits living and dying, because they thought of their circuits as cybernetic organisms. Their friend, the author Anais Nin, wrote that The front room of their apartment is completely filled with equipment. It is a jungle of electronic instruments, knobs, wires, as complex as the control panel of an airplane. It is separated from the living room by soundproof glass. And here are some of their notes on how they think their circuits are somehow related to cybernetics. But here's where it all loops back to John Cage. So, as I said, they made this tremendously amazing score for this famous science fiction movie. It was the first fully electronic score ever made for a movie. But in addition to doing that, they also worked with John Cage. They worked on a very key piece called Williams Mix, which was this key piece of tape music. Their lives tell a story not only of the history of electronic music, but of bohemian downtown New York in the 50s. So one of the things I find so fascinating, the more that I learn about electronic music, is that I don't just learn about music itself. I learn about culture, I learn about history, I learn about World War II, I learn about all of these different things. I learn about technology. And that's why I find these stories, like I said, so captivating. But the Barons, they had a very strange life. They're both dead now. They were in a secret science fiction society with Aldous Huxley, Ray Bradbury, and L. Ron Hubbard, before L. Ron Hubbard really went to the dark side, in the 50s. It totally makes sense that science fiction authors and electronic musicians were hanging out with each other. They were both trying to invent the future in their own way. And so it's in these stories that you find a lot of strange tales. You find a lot of strange relevance. Here's a schematic for a circuit that they built in the 1950s. And they were not pro circuit designers at all, as you can probably tell by looking at this. They were really did not know what they were doing for the most part, and they were mostly self-taught. And that's another reason why I find it so fascinating. Part of what electronic music helped us to do was it helped to show us that anybody could make music. How many of you guys have a traditional music background? Like you play piano or flute or something like that. So, yeah, I had to play piano in conservatory for 10 years. I played viola, I played flute, I played all these things. But when I discovered electronic music, there was something so liberating about it. There was something so unreal about it, that it was so fascinating simply because it let the bar be really low. It said that anybody could make these sounds. Anybody could do this stuff, and that you could really, these days, it's such a luxury to even think that you could do this stuff from your home. And so, in their own unique ways, all of the people that I sort of talked about today, whether it be Raymond Scott, Louis and Bibi Barron, Todd Dockstader, they all helped to push electronic music into the mainstream, into our mainstream consciousness. And they showed that they kind of helped predict the future by being so DIY. Because today, anyone can run a home studio on a laptop, of course. Any one of us can make sounds that we never thought possible. And so I guess I'd like to close by talking a little bit about the current nature of electronic music. That one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that this stuff isn't a historical curiosity. Like, these things that I'm talking about aren't preserved in amber and somewhere far, far away. And also that the history of electronic music is not just a Western history. That's another thing we need to remember. That there were people making electronic music in Egypt. There were people making electronic music in Iran, India, all over the world, Africa. There were people making electronic music. But also that it's possibly the most vital form of music we have going, because today all music is electronic. So if you look at, this is the LP cover for Forbidden Planet, and I included this because so you can see what it says on the top. It says electronic tonalities, not electronic music. That it's a reminder that the concept of electronic music used to be perceived as so threatening and so alien and so horrifying that you couldn't say it was music, that you had to say it was tonalities, you had to say it was noise. You couldn't give it the term music back then as easily. Varese was a famous composer, and he would present huge things with a full orchestra. Ionization was scored for like 36 percussion instruments. But Varese used to leave his performances in tears. This was in the 30s and 40s. He'd be like, they don't get it. They don't get it. There were people who would walk out of his performances because they didn't understand what he was trying to do. So I think it's useful to learn about this history because we realize that electronic music was considered tremendously revolutionary. It was considered tremendously strange. But also that we realize that it's so unbelievably ubiquitous. Electronic music is so ubiquitous today that it's almost not even worth mentioning. Absolutely everything we listen to is electronic. Absolutely everything that we hear has some electronic basis. And I mean, unless you're listening to somebody play an acoustic guitar on the street, where you could argue it's not really electronic. But the other thing that often gets lost, and this is sort of the last thing I'll say, that I've noticed in kind of talking about electronic music with people is that disco is electronic music, hip-hop is electronic music, techno is obviously electronic music, electro, all of this stuff. You know, all of this stuff continued to have a life. It took different forms. I would argue that electronic dance music is now bigger than ever before. But one of the things Todd Dockstader told me in the nursing home when I talked to him last year for Wired, he said, I never had any idea that this thing we call electronic music would ever have any value, that anybody would ever care about this. You know, he really thought of it as something he would do late at night, you know, messing with his radios or messing with his tapes, and that it was a hobby. It was this weird hobbyist thing that would never catch on. And so he said, I never thought it would have any value. And I just thought that was such a curious statement. And one of the things that happens when you have Alzheimer's is that you can remember the deep, deep past, but you can't really recall the present very well. And so I tried to explain to him, I was sitting there with him in the nursing home, and I tried to say, well, actually, electronic music really grew after the 50s. And it took on all these forms, and it went to all of these different places. And it became this big thing. And he said, really? It did? And I said, yes, it did. It became this huge thing. It took over the pop charts. It took over everything. So I think it's useful studying the 20th century, studying the past, gives us some useful perspective on what's happening today. So thanks. If there are any questions, I'll take questions.